Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Deltarune Theory video. Took a little break, it's been a little bit. Can't blame me, I've been distracted. But hey, we're back with the promised Rudy video. And you know what? The timing kind of worked out because it gave you guys plenty of time to answer the community post I put up about this topic, which I'm going to be referencing in this video. So, you know, fate. Sometimes it's all prophesized, right? That's how this is supposed to work. Anyway, the point of this video is an overall character analysis of Rudy, and then an analysis of the Rudy Knight theory. So, before going into this, I want you to know I'm kind of gonna be mean to Rudy. I kind of am. He's gonna be a bad guy during this theory video a little bit. So, you know, there were some people who were made uncomfortable by that very notion when I suggested it in the Origins of Darkness video, which was like a month ago now. So just be warned, scary times ahead. So let's start with why I'm making this video, which, yes, you can tell that this idea was from like a month ago, but during the Deltarune anniversary stream, Undertale anniversary stream that just happened to have a lot of weird Deltarune, I don't want to say hints, but inclusions. There was one sort of repeated notion that made me want to tackle this video right after the Origins of Darkness one. And that was Toby talking about characters and their flaws. Specifically, there's a section with Alphys where he says, you know, Alphys, certain parts of this character haven't aged the best, but I'm really glad I made a character like Alphys, someone who can be strong in different circumstances. And I just thought that was very interesting because, of course, Toriel has this big, flawed moment at the end of Deltarune Chapter 4, which is very interesting. And it really leads into this thought that this is how Toby writes characters, which is, you know, the good way to write characters. So, I think we can all agree that Rudy is going to have a bigger role in Deltarune going forward than he has so far, which is essentially just cameos leading up to some sort of bigger role. And now that we've established this idea that Toby's characters always have some sort of flaw, at least one big one, what would Rudy's be? Well, let's look at his relationships. With Noelle, Chris, Susie, Toriel, and Asgore, everybody seems to like him, and him and Carol presumably are still together. Like, we haven't heard that they've broken up or anything, so everything seems to be going pretty well there. But that's kind of weird, right? How can he be friends with all of these people who have these very different sides on so many issues? Like, Asgore and Toriel are directly in conflict right now. How can he be equally good friends with both of them unless he's just kind of going with the flow and not bothering to help either of them, right? Or support either of them in any way. And when he talks about Noelle and Carol, here's what he has to say. Noelle, her mother looks like she has it all. She might look like she has it all, but her mother, you know, love her, but she's tough on her. Normally I balance it all out, but I can't do much when I'm not there. But I'm gonna get better. I have to. So, like, he's not actually trying to intervene in this situation, right? What he's doing is, oh, well, Carol is cruel, but I'm nice. So we'll just let Carol continue to be cruel, and I'll be nice, and overall, Noelle will still have a happy life. That's not really how it works, man. But it shows Rudy's thought process, or at least what I believe his thought process to be, which is avoidance. Rudy does not want to get into it with anybody. Because instead of taking a side between Asgore and Toriel, he just tries to stay out of it. He's regularly friendly to both, even when Toriel's specifically expressing her discomfort in the church in Chapter 4, where she says, you know, I like Carol still, but I wish she wouldn't help Asgore on his quest to get me back, right? And Rudy just goes like, oh, it's Carol, like, come on, you gotta still like my wife. It's a little weird. And of course, as I just said with Noelle and Carol, he doesn't actually change anything for the benefit of Noelle or side with Carol against her, which that feels like it would be against his character, but still. He just tries to balance things out without actually making any change, right? So maybe when it came to Des, a person who, as we've sort of looked at in the past, was all about trying to make a change, he made a bad call. So Des. I've talked about in a previous video how I think Des's room is meant to clue us into one specific thing about her life, which is that she wasn't getting to live the life she wanted. It goes along with the main theme of Deltarune. Your choices don't matter in this world, right? So there's all these expensive but dented and sort of broken items all over Des's room. Specifically, I want to sort of laser focus in on the instruments. There's a violin, a flute, a microphone. In the closet, there's a drum kit, and of course, she has her guitar. The interesting thing about this, though, is that we know Des's main passion in music was rock music. All of these other instruments, though, maybe not the microphone, but still, you could interpret them as being for classical or, more respectable kinds of music. So we know that Rudy doesn't want to actually change anything, but he wouldn't want Des to be unhappy. So if Des likes music, maybe his way of trying to solve this problem, where Carol doesn't want her playing rock music, is to buy her a bunch of instruments that would, appease Carol. Maybe if she gets into the violin, this problem will just go away and I won't have to pick a side. You know what I mean? And, of course, if this was the way he was trying to help Des while she's going through this rebellious teenage phase, of course, she would see him as being manipulative. He is quite literally, even though it's out of a good place, maybe, trying to manipulate her into giving up on something that is causing problems in the household. What if we took that to its logical extreme? Something I've noticed recently is that nobody calls Des December, ever. Even somebody like Susie, right, whose name is literally just Susie, still gets called Susan by Birdley as a joke, right? But this character is never actually called December in the game, except for one time, but we'll get to that in a second. I think it actually proves my point more than anything. In the Spampton Sweepstakes page, deltarune.com/December, you get a fake 404, which says this page cannot be found. The page you are looking for might have been removed or had its name changed or is temporarily unavailable. So, of course, this could just be that, Des is lost, she's out of the plot, so the page is temporarily unavailable. However, in order to actually access the page about Des, you have to change the heading from deltarune.com/December to deltarune.com/Des. Which leads me to believe the problem with this page is that it's had its name changed. And interestingly, there is another point where a name change is brought up in relation to the Holiday family. So, there's this cactus in Noelle's room, right? And immediately upon entering the room and checking it, Chris says it's named Christmas, right? You remember it's named Christmas, which, coincidentally, is the nickname that Rudy calls Chris. Rudy constantly is calling Chris Christmas. And then, of course, we have the line about the cactus being changed to Soon Soon. What this could be symbolically representing is that Rudy still thinks of Chris as a member of the Holiday family, like the conjoined Holiday Dreamer family. So saying Christmas is a way to include Chris in their family, which their main theme is being holiday themed, right? Christmas themed specifically. So, if Des tried to change her name from December, which is of course Christmas themed, to Des, what would happen? Well, that is symbolically representing her desire to separate herself from her family, right? She wants to get away from the holiday associations that her family has. She wants to be a completely different person. So if I go back for a second, whoops, too far back, and look at these instruments, instead of thinking of them as classical instruments that are more traditional than rock instruments, you could say a flute, a violin, even the drums, and singing, or perhaps caroling, are all things that relate to a sort of Christmas-y aesthetic. And similarly, we also have like roller skates and ice skates and hockey equipment in this room, which was maybe a way for them to try to get Des away from baseball and into a more holiday-themed sport. I really think this could be the breaking point for Des and what made her run away or something like that. The thing that happened right before she disappeared was her saying, "It's not December anymore. I want to be called Des." And everyone saying, well, okay, Rudy and Carol saying, "No, you don't get to choose that." Specifically, I'm looking at this comment from Sengoku Glasses. Sengoku Glasses. I didn't even notice it was a real word. Sorry. Which says, in response, maybe she got admonished with, "You don't get to choose who you are in this world. Your name is December." And so that line that is played at the beginning after our vessel is discarded is to bring this whole thing full circle, right? Fleur Rouge's comment, Fleur Rouge 606, they point out that the way that Rudy still calls Chris Christmas to this day might be less about including Chris in the family out of a sense of, a desire to keep them close, and more so potentially as a desire to say, like, you're a part of this family too, in a way. You have to help us find December, because if Rudy is the knight, then of course he's probably involved in the conspiracy, which of course seems to involve Chris and Carol at the least. So, with all of that said, I do think it's interesting that Rudy is clearly a nickname short for Rudolph, right? Rudolph is actually Christmas related, whereas Rudy isn't. And I think that might tell us what lesson Rudy learned from this situation, which is that maybe his action, he views his action here of saying, "No, Des, you can't change your name," as being the thing that caused her to disappear. And therefore, he is now afraid of changing things. One way or the other, it provides him some sort of pathos, which would cause him to potentially want to become the knight. That's basically the argument here. And, of course, by changing his name, or at least what people call him, from Rudolph to Rudy, he's sort of honoring this promise he's made with Des to, fix things when they find her. And here's the kicker. The only person who ever calls Des December in the entirety of Deltarune is Tana, the character who is purposefully behind the times, right? The character who doesn't know that Azrael went to college, doesn't know that Des disappeared. So it adds credence to this idea that the Des thing might have been the final straw. All right, now I get into the Rudy Knight analysis. And I've been pretty charitable to Rudy Knight so far. And that kind of ends now. The point of this section is to explain what the good points are to the best of my ability, and then sort of rein it back in a little bit to the best of my ability. A balanced approach, you might say. So, let us begin. These pieces of evidence were all gained by scrolling through your comments on that community post that I made about Rudy Knight. And I basically boiled them down into their main points, and the number beside them is how many different people mentioned that in their posts. So these three here were only mentioned by one person. So they're obviously not the strongest evidence in support of Rudy Knight, but, I couldn't just leave them out, right? So the first one is Gaster's List, and this is a very interesting sort of under the surface theory, I would say. It's like a theory that informs other theories. And what it is essentially is in the Goner Maker sequence at the very beginning of Deltarune, you can name your character and name you can name you and name your vessel. Let's just put it that way to be very clear. And if you name specifically Susie, Noelle, Chris, Toriel, Azriel, Asgore, Sans, Papyrus, Alphys, Undyne, Rudy, Birdly, Caddy, Braddy, Gerson, Jockington, or QC, you get a response from Gaster. No one else gets a response. And the point of the person who said Gaster's List is a boon for the Rudy Knight theory is that neither Carol or Des are on this list. And you'd assume that the people in this list are fairly important. I mean, maybe, Caddy, Braddy, and a lot of the Undertale characters could be written off as like, okay, these are characters people might try to put in the character menu right after coming out of Undertale, and so you'd want to write a response there. But Rudy's name is in this list, and he's a new Deltarune character who we had no idea about. So it certainly seems like he's going to be important. And honestly, I would agree with that. I definitely think Rudy is going to be important. Also, I want to point out while I'm talking about this, Caddy with a Y is in there, which is the older sister from Undertale, but Caddy with an I isn't, and Jockington is. And nobody's going to accidentally put in Jockington. So I don't know what that means. Maybe I'll do a full theory on Gaster's List at some point, but I just found that kind of strange. Anyway, I think Gaster's List not containing Carol or Des's names is actually somewhat expected, because their names are specifically meant to be mysterious. We didn't learn Carol's name until Chapter 4. Since the very beginning of the game, the best we got was a C. Clearly, that was something Toby wanted to keep under wraps until she showed up. Des, of course, is the game's big mystery. That's like if Gaster's name was in this list. And notably, I mean, this is Gaster's list, but Gaster's name isn't in this list. And we believe Gaster is important to this world, right? So this list obviously isn't hard and fast. And if Des is purposefully meant to be lost or missing from the game of Deltarune and we have to find her, then it only makes sense she wouldn't be in this list, even if she is a major character in the game. So I don't think this is necessarily huge points for Rudy as the knight. I think it's just huge points for Rudy being important, which is something I think, again, we can all agree on, no matter how we think he will be. You know what I mean? Number 2. Rudy seems very interested in Dragon Blazers, which is a game we now know is based off of the prophecy. And that's true, it's something I never thought about before. It's kind of interesting. The only problem is, like, everything in Deltarune seems to be based off the prophecy. Like, the church's religion is based off the prophecy, the Lord of the Hammer is based off the prophecy, and it's pretty clear that Rudy goes to the church, so he wouldn't need to be into Dragon Blazers to know about the prophecy, necessarily. So him being into it, I don't think really adds much, unfortunately. As much as it could be something we look back on if he is the knight and go like, he knows what to do. But even then, in the scene where Noelle is playing Dragon Blazers, Rudy makes a wrong decision. He says to use Fire Shock on the ice boss, and then the ice boss reflects fire attacks. So if he truly is, like, knowledgeable of the prophecy because he's the knight, you'd think he would have got it surprisingly right. Like, you'd think the sort of intrigue would be, oh, how did he know that the ice boss reflects fire attacks before Noelle even tried that, rather than the other way around? You know what I mean? And yes, you could argue, well, he's just playing it up so that we don't, pay attention. But again, you can say that for literally every piece of counter evidence ever, and while it could be true, it's not the strongest defense, right? Finally, for this slide, the knight's appearance could just be a disguise. And I guess that's literally true. Once again, this is kind of like an argument that's like, well, you can't say it's not true. But I believe it's based mostly on This scene in chapter 4 where Susie goes in to meet Gerson and get the sheet music you need to progress. And you can, of course, think about Susie, or you are given the option to think about the knight. And if you do that, then Chris kind of hijacks the scene and thinks about the knight taking off its helmet, and Jockington is underneath, and then it's a whole comical scene about Jockington. And this is used, at least by some people, to say that, okay, the knight's appearance actually doesn't really matter, because Chris proves in this sort of comedy scene that the knight can take off its helmet. So clearly that's just a disguise and isn't indicative of anything to actually do with the knight. And the problem with that line of thinking, for this theory specifically, is it doesn't help it at all. If the knight's outfit is just a disguise, then the knight does not have to be a Holiday family member, which I personally think is still possible, even though I think it makes a lot of thematic sense for it to be a member of the Holiday family. But that doesn't mean it's more likely Rudy, right? That's all I can say about the matter, I think. So, with 2 people mentioning it, we have this scene that I've been referencing in the video so far of Asgore in Carol and Rudy's room at the conspiracy board talking about their plans. And, I'll quote him. Here we go. "We're almost there, aren't we, old friend? This time for sure. Tori will finally see what really happened, that I just wanted to protect everyone. And this time she'll have to believe me. They all will. Then we'll all be a happy family again, won't we? It sure is beautiful, isn't it? This black shard." Now, of course, the black shard is very suspicious because we get that as an item after beating the knight in chapter 3, and it seems to be a part of the knight's sword, so what does that even mean? Why does Asgore have that? We're going to find out in chapter 5, but presumably, if we don't, I'll be angry. But the point that people are lasering in on is the old friend part, because Rudy is, of course, Asgore's old friend. That's what they are. They're old friends, right? They're old buddies. So he's saying, we're almost there, aren't we, old friend? And that could imply, of course, that Rudy is working alongside him and potentially Carol in trying to find Des in this grand conspiracy plan. And therefore he's including Rudy here. The thing is, though, as I mentioned earlier, Rudy doesn't really seem to be specifically supportive of Asgore in his quest to try to reunite his family. Like, he's friendly enough about Asgore, but he never mentions, like, yeah, he's might be going about it the wrong way, but Asgore's intentions are the right thing to do. Like, he doesn't even give him that much. He's just upset about him bringing him roses because it has implications. And so the idea that this would be talking about Rudy and they're in it together and he totally supports Asgore's plans, it could be true, but I feel like it's more likely that when he says old friend here, he's actually referencing Carol. Because what is Carol to him other than an old friend, right? Like, obviously Rudy is his old friend. That is true. But he's also been friends with Carol for quite a long time now, and you can't really call their relationship anything else than family friends, right? They're friends through Rudy, basically. So when he says, we're almost there, aren't we, old friend? He could clearly be talking about Carol. And even if he is talking about Rudy, it doesn't necessarily mean he's even in on the plan, right? It's such a vague line. It's such a Toby Fox vague line that's meant to get us thinking. But he could say, we're almost there, old friend, talking about Rudy. And then that's sort of the end of that thought. And then he says, this time Tori will see, everyone will see, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll all be a happy family again, won't we? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean he has to be in league with Rudy. Although, of course, again, if Rudy is the knight, we can look back on this scene and go, oh, you sly dog, literally in this case, to Toby. 5 people said it'd be funny as their evidence for Rudy being the knight. I mean, not really, but it kind of basically was. And then, of course, 5 people mentioned, well, he has a good motive, which is to find Des, which is true. And the reason you don't see, like, a little text box here with points of refutation is because these points are totally true. No, it's because these points are irrefutable, I think. And that's not me saying, pack it up, everybody, Rudy's the knight. It's more so saying, well, yes, obviously Rudy would want to find Des. The problem with saying, well, Rudy has motive to find Des is that, like, so does Carol, and so does Asgore, and so does, like, Azriel and Chris, and there's so many other people who their motive could be finding Des. What if, like, you know, Caddy and Brady, one of them secretly was friends with Des and we never knew it? The motive for finding Des doesn't really add much to Rudy Knight as much as it's just like, okay, well, that's what his motive would be. It's like, all right, sure. We're pretty sure that is the Knight's motive, or at least the conspiracy of Carol and probably Chris and probably Asgore. That's their motive, at least. We know people want to find her, is what I'm saying. But we don't know necessarily that that means the people who want to find her are in league with the Knight specifically. And then, you know, he's too nice not to be a twist villain / it'd be funny. I mean, there's just no argument against that. If you think it'd be funny, that's true. It's not evidence. And if you think he's too nice not to be a twist villain, that's not evidence either. Like, he can be a villain without being the Knight. Like, Carol, we assume, isn't the Knight, at least most people. I know there is a large contingent who do. And guess what? There's actually... I'm going to support your theory later for a few seconds while I'm playing devil's advocate. But hey, we mostly believe that Carol is a red herring right now, but she's clearly still an antagonist, right? Like, she's someone we're going to have to overcome in order to get into the shelter. So what's to stop Rudy from being something like that? If you think he has to be an antagonist because he's being too nice right now, then that doesn't mean he's the Knight, is what I'm saying. Anyway, that's this slide. 7 people mentioned he acts weirdly cold to Susie. I had not seen these lines of dialogue before, so thanks for bringing them to my attention. I do have a logical explanation that I can say as devil's advocate here, though. So let's talk about the sort of funny thing we would look back on and go, oh, if Rudy was the Knight. And that is in chapter 2, if you introduce Susie to Rudy, he goes, Susie, huh? She goes, yeah. He goes, lay a finger on her and I'll kick your ass. Just kidding. Well, kind of kidding. Which is, of course, supposed to be a play on this whole trope of the overprotective father. And yeah, of course, if Rudy is the Knight, he is going to kick Susie's ass later. So that's a funny, ironic line in retrospect, right? The more interesting one is the line you get if you do not introduce Susie to Rudy in chapter 2. Like, you don't visit him at all. And then you visit him with Susie in chapter 4, where instead he says, Chris, why the hell did you bring your friend here? Susie goes, I don't know, man. Chris, why did you? And then Rudy laughs. It's just so crazy. You gotta laugh. And then after that, he refuses to talk to you anymore. And yeah, that's hella suspicious. That's so suspicious. Like, it really does conjure this idea of Rudy and Chris being in on this conspiracy together. And Chris bringing Susie here after the fight in chapter 3 where Rudy and Susie fought before they even met each other. And him now being unable to separate these things and being like, Chris, why the hell would you bring her here? You know, like, you're in on our plan. You're supposed to be working with me. Why are you doing this to me? You know, that sort of a thing. Are you betraying the cause by bringing Susie here to try to hit me in the light world? However, I do think there's actually a reasonable explanation for why this is the dialogue here. And it comes from asking the question why this dialogue change would be implemented if Rudy is not the Knight. And I think the context really does help here, because right before this happens, Rudy's gone to the church, right? And in the normal route where you have already visited him in chapter 2 with Susie, You guys have a fairly normal conversation with Rudy, but Rudy is really weak. He's coughing a lot, and he can barely kind of, stay lucid. It's meant to sort of inform us that, oh, his condition's getting worse, right? Like, he's not actually that much better. He just pushed himself to go to the church, and now he's going to push himself again, which is probably not going to be good. So I think his reaction in this scene, where he has never met Susie before, and Susie is a very important person to him, right? Even though they've never met, because he knows that Noelle, his beloved daughter, has the biggest crush ever on Susie. So this being Susie's first impression of him, in the hospital, barely able to hold it together, coughing fits and all, it would prompt a response like, Chris, why the hell would you bring Susie here now, right? It's just so crazy, I gotta laugh. Because this is going to be forever, like, they always say you only get one first impression. This is forever going to be Susie's first impression of Rudy. Him being super weak and barely able to move and not being his normal cheerful self. Which, of course, I did mention earlier in this video, is perhaps a front he's putting up. He doesn't like to be seen unhappy. He doesn't like to even sort of feel those emotions, right? So the idea that you are letting Susie, this person he really wants to have a decent relationship with, see this part of himself that he doesn't want anyone to see, much less her, it could cause this kind of a response, in my opinion. Of course, if Rudy is the knight, this is huge evidence for it. And I do think it's probably maybe the most compelling one I've seen so far, because he's clearly acting a little bit evil and clearly, maybe not evil, but suspicious, and clearly is talking to Chris as if they are working together on something and Chris is doing something unexpected. Like, yeah. I just do think there is a logical explanation. He doesn't have to be the knight because of this. 8 people mentioned that being in the hospital is actually a great alibi. So, I'm going to read the 4 points people put up before I read the counter arguments this time. So, because he's in the hospital, he's situated closely to the 3 fountains made by the knight. No one would really be looking for him. So, if Carol was the knight, she's the mayor. Presumably people would be looking for her all the time. It would be very hard for her to find the time to be the knight. And the hospital is always inaccessible right before a dark fountain is created, which is a little suspicious. And the sort of joke point here for the 4th one is that the nurse in the hospital has no eyes, so he could clearly sneak past her whenever he wanted. Which, I guess that's not wrong. It is kind of funny. I do think she has to be aware, though, because she notices Chris, and Chris doesn't talk. So, unless she has really good hearing, in which case Rudy would also struggle to sneak past her anyway. So, just, I didn't really need to counter that point, but whatever, it happened. So, Rudy is always inaccessible right before a dark fountain is created. True, but same thing is also true of Toriel, Asgore, Carol. And basically the entire town is made inaccessible when a fountain is being created. In Chapter 4, the rain makes everyone lock their doors. In Chapter 2, there's a traffic jam, so you can only go to the library and the school. In Chapter 1, you go to the school, and that's it, right? You can't see anyone before you go there. You can't leave the school. So, it's not that surprising that the hospital would be inaccessible before a dark fountain is made. That's true of, every building ever. So it's not really that strong of evidence, despite how interesting it sounds on the surface. And the reason why all these buildings are getting locked off all the time is because if not, then they would have to spend time writing flavor text for everyone for this different time in the day, right? Oh, why doesn't anyone talk about the rain? Well, instead of having to write dialogue about the rain for everybody, they just close the town because it's raining and nobody wants to go outside. And the point is, you've already talked to everybody anyway, so you're not really losing out on anything by doing that. So I don't think this is necessarily a super strong point, but, it's there. Why does it matter if Rudy is close to the locations where the fountains are being made? I mean, it sounds like it's a good point on the surface, once again, right? Like, okay, he's close to these locations, so that would make sense why they're made in these very specific locations, the church, the library, and the school. But if his motive for making the fountains is finding Des and not causing the roaring, which I don't think it can be causing the roaring, because if so, he could have done it at any time. Why would he choose these 3 locations because they're close to him? Right? Like, sure, maybe Des does have an association with the school classroom and the library and maybe even the church, although the church is definitely the weakest one of these 3, considering we don't even see like a hope candle for Des, I don't think. And so if he's trying to find Des, his proximity to them shouldn't really matter. He should be going as far as it takes to get to the locations where Des would be most likely to show up, right? He shouldn't be like strategizing to go to these places that are close if his goal is to find somebody specific, because why would she be there? Right? Unless he's just going to open a dark fountain in every building until he finds her like it's whack-a-mole. The other option, that he's going to these places that are close to make fountains, and the fountains are all close to the hospital because he has to go to places that are close to him, also doesn't really make sense, right? If he's so sick that he can only go to these places that are super close, then why is he even the knight at all? Why can't somebody else in the plan presumably do it? And even if he is on his own, Rudy is the kind of person to push himself for the sake of Noelle. Why would he not do the same for Des? Anyway, on the point of no one being looking for him while he's in the hospital, people actually are looking for him. You know, Noelle obviously comes to visit him after her class every day. So if the traffic jam wasn't there, like, did he make the traffic jam happen? Because otherwise, he'd be in pretty big trouble if he was still stuck somehow in Chapter 2's Dark World, and Noelle went to the hospital to greet him after school, and he wasn't there. So I don't think being in the hospital necessarily means no one's looking for him. And even if, he can plan around Noelle's schedule, Asgore doesn't have a schedule. He could show up whenever. And I guess he could be part of the conspiracy, of course, but we'll get to that in a moment. How that can also be used to explain a lot of things without actually, having to explain. Carol and Rudy have to be connected. It's all connected. Pepe Sylvia. All right, so 9 people mentioned that Carol and Rudy are connected. That's the basic point. And very specifically, a few of those 9 people mentioned that the things we associate it with Des and Carol when it comes to the knight, like the baseball bat animation for Des, or the katana-looking sword for Carol, and the antlers, could be things that Rudy has actually introduced to them. Maybe Rudy was actually really into baseball, and Rudy and Des used to play baseball together. And maybe Rudy was also into katanas, and Carol and Rudy are both into katanas, and we just don't even know. So the main point is, what if Rudy is actually the one behind all of that, and we don't know yet? So let me show you the maximalist version of this conspiracy I have been mentioning throughout the video. This is the maximum amount of people that can feasibly be a part of this conspiracy as far as I can imagine. So let's start on the Chris side of the conspiracy here. We know Chris and Carol are connected through that line in Chapter 4, and maybe the phone calls where Chris seems to call Carol to the holiday house to collect the guitar. So that one's fairly self-evident. We know Chris is working with the knight, so that puts the knight within this conspiracy, whether the knight's Rudy, Carol, or Des, right? We know Chris is the only person who is currently getting in touch with Azrael. Everyone asks Chris about Azrael, which implies that they can't ask Azrael himself, right? So perhaps the reason why Azrael is only contacting Chris is because Azrael is also part of this conspiracy. working as, like, he faked going to college and actually went to search the dark worlds for deaths or something like that, You've seen stuff about that before, I'm sure. And Ralsei, one I've never heard anybody bring up before, but he literally has to be involved in this, would be connected to Chris through those moments where they are talking alone. And the reason why I say he has to be connected is because Ralsei knows the prophecy, and the prophecy foretells everything that is going to happen within Deltarune's plot. Even if we presume it's only the stuff that happens in the Dark Worlds, Ralsei already has to know that Chris and the Knight are working together, right? Which means, even if he's not officially a part of it, Ralsei is a part of this conspiracy. He's working with Chris and the Knight because, he's not stopping them. And this actually kind of potentially explains the they/them or Chris Cross or the Chris Slash theory, which has 3 names, which is annoying. But the theory itself was fun. The idea that Chris would betray Susie and Ralsei after the night fight, and they are actually the one that slashes them down, which explains Ralsei's surprisingly betrayed-sounding reaction of, how could you, when Susie goes down? If the Knight was slashing Susie, why would Ralsei say, how could you? Ralsei should know the Knight's the bad guy. Well, if Ralsei knows the prophecy, and Ralsei knows that Chris is working with the Knight, and Ralsei has talked to Chris about the Knight, and Chris has said, yeah, we're working together, it's okay, we're going to do what we have to do, then Ralsei has no reason to believe the Knight's actually a bad guy. Ralsei should believe that, okay, just like Chris, they're doing what they have to in order to, get a better ending for this story. And so when the Knight cruelly cuts down Susie for no real reason, Ralsei can go, how could you? Because he believed the Knight was a better person than that. And then, of course, the Knight turns him into a pile of fluff. So, owned, I guess. Let's move to the Carol side of the conspiracy now. Asgore is the obvious one. We don't know whether they're directly collaborating or if Carol is just, letting Asgore think he's sneaking around her house and kind of keeping him on a leash to try to get him to investigate where she can't. Either way, they're both involved in this conspiracy to find Des, right? Rudy would be involved as well through Carol in this particular, Rudy Knight theory, right? Because we know the Knight is connected to the conspiracy through Chris, and so if Rudy is the Knight, then Rudy would be connected to the conspiracy, obviously. Even if Rudy isn't the Knight, there's a good chance he knows what's going on, right? At least there is a chance. Even if I don't necessarily think it's a good one. And finally, Alvin. Oh, the Alvin Knight guy wants Alvin to be important still. Point and laugh. But, there is some reason for this. We don't really have a reason why the fountain was made in the church yet. Maybe it was to try to get Toriel, and she dodged it by getting drunk with Sans. But if the goal is actually to find Des, and it's not specifically about Toriel at all necessarily, and maybe the Knight was just going to kidnap Toriel to help, Chris be able to move around easier so they could do their plans better. There's no real reason to make the fountain in the church. It's not specifically connected to Des like the library or the classroom where she used to be in school, right? But it is very specifically connected to Gerson. And in fact, the Dark Fountain here revives Gerson, which proves that it is possible to revive a person who is dead with a Dark Fountain. And maybe that was the point. That's Alvin's role in this conspiracy, is to dig up Gerson's hammer and put it in the library to test their theory. The reason why I think he could be connected, though, beyond that, is that there are 3 codes used to access the shelter, clearly a location Carol does not want anybody getting into, and neither does Chris, based on the phone call. If that is true, the 3 symbols relate to the Holiday family, which would be Carol, of course, the police chief, which used to be Asgore, was now Undyne, who the Knight interestingly captured in Chapter 3, and the 3rd one is an image of the Deltarune, which Susie in Chapter 4 likens to be someone who goes to the church, right? Like a person related to the church. And there's really no one that can be other than Alvin. Like, you could argue it was Gerson, but Gerson, as we know from his letter to Alvin, wasn't actually that involved in the church. So, it has to be Alvin. Besides, Alvin has the frickin' Deltarune on the front of his shirt. Like, if we are going with symbols, he is the most obvious one. And so, if these 3 shelter codes were picked for a specific reason, and it wasn't just 3 people who are upstanding members of the community, then Alvin would probably be involved in this somehow. And he does have a decent motive, so I can't say it's not possible. But okay, that's the maximalist version. What's the minimalist version of this conspiracy? That's it. Like I said, Ralsei has to know because he knows everything that's going to happen. So the fact that he's doing mysterious conversations with Chris every chapter leads me to believe, yeah, he's probably talking to Chris about this specifically. And we know Chris is at least talking to the Knight on the phone because the text boxes look like the Knight. Very astute deduction. And we know Carol is at least working with Asgore to an extent. Whether or not they are directly working with each other or not, they're clearly working in tandem to try to find Des. Okay, but how could Chris and Carol not be connected, right? Like, sure, Asriel could not be involved. Maybe, Chris was just phoning Asriel often because they didn't really have a support system until Susie showed up. Rudy could not be involved because he's in the hospital, so maybe Carol doesn't want to involve him. Alvin definitely has reason not to be involved. Like, he's so outside this holiday family drama that it doesn't really even make sense for him to be here. How could Carol and Chris not be in the same conspiracy, though? What about everything that happened at the holiday house? Well, I've explained it before, and I'll explain it again. Here's the major red herring theory, which is that everything inside the Holiday Mansion is meant to point us in the direction of Carol as the Knight, including the phone calls. And they're all a red herring. How? Well, okay, in the weird route, Noelle obviously can't get a phone call from Birdley, like what happens in the normal route of Chapter 4. So instead, she gets a call from Carol, and the two talk about dinner plans, which Noelle doesn't have any, because nobody's there to cook for her. And Noelle goes, "It's fine, Mom, I'll cook for myself." "I won't burn myself, come on." And then she just hangs up the phone, and we don't see the phone get used again. So presumably, Carol is like, well, can't have that. And she comes to the house to try to cook Noelle dinner, to make sure she doesn't burn the house down, and finds Susie with the guitar and takes the guitar. Because the phone call that Chris makes to the person and says, "Susie, guitar," doesn't happen in the weird route. I mean, I guess it's possible that it could have happened between the scene where you traumatize Noelle and put the thorn back in her finger and the scene where Chris pulls us out and stomps on us in the bathroom. But would Chris really go, "I want to tear this soul to pieces. Wait, first I need to take a phone call"? I don't know. That seems a little weird to me. Again, it's not impossible, but it does seem a little odd. I think the justification is supposed to be that because of the phone call about dinner, Carol shows up at the house. So what if that happens in the normal route too? Remember, Noelle, of course, gets the phone call from Birdley, and then Susie throws her phone away. So if Carol was trying to get in contact with Noelle, she would be unable to. And, of course, being the overbearing mother that she is, undoubtedly, the second she can't get in contact with Noelle, she beelines it like she goes around town searching for Noelle. Like, where is she? What is she doing? I need to know where she is every second of every day. And, of course, finds her at home and finds Susie with the guitar. And, yeah. That would be the argument for how Chris and Carol are not connected. Here's an alternative argument, though, if you don't like that one. What if the Knight is connected to Carol, but Carol isn't connected to Chris? Like, the Knight can phone Carol and go, "There's someone at your house and you don't know," and Carol can go, "Who are you? What are you talking about?" and then run home, without having to actually be in the conspiracy together. Is that possible? Is it possible? Maybe. Okay, so this is, like, obviously these are both somewhat unrealistic, right? There's probably more going on in this minimalist version. There's probably less going on than in this maximalist version. And my point of saying this is, if you're willing to go with this maximalist version, everything that happens in Deltarune is because of this conspiracy, right? Like, the reason the fountains at the church is because Alvin is part of the conspiracy. And Asriel, he didn't go to college. It's all because of the conspiracy. And Asgore is going to be in Chapter 5, and Rudy is the knight, and it's all the conspiracy. I think our ideas of what this is are probably a bit overblown because we just saw it for the first time in the most recent chapter. I don't think it's going to be as big of a part of the plot as it maybe seems at this particular moment. Just because if there are 8 people involved in this, confronting all 8 of them, we just don't have that much time. We don't have that much time. So realistically, I honestly think this is more realistic. The idea that we would confront Ralsei, confront Chris, confront Carol, confront Asgore, and confront the Knight, than confronting everyone here. Right? We're already probably going to fight Asgore in the next chapter because there's a prophecy tagged with Boss that's about him, the Flower Man. We know we're going to fight the Knight again at some point. We know something's coming to a head between Susie, Chris, and Ralsei because they're all keeping secrets. Well, Susie isn't. Maybe she is. But Chris and Ralsei definitely are keeping secrets. And we've definitely been set up to believe that we are going to face Carol at some point. So after saying all that, hopefully you can understand why I don't find the idea that Carol and Rudy are in the conspiracy together to be definitive evidence. And again, that's the point. My point isn't to say, haha, you're wrong. My point is to say, there is room for doubt. Because I think it's very easy when you've got a theory that you like a lot to go, oh, this is raw proof. No one could think otherwise than this unless they were an idiot. So this is just, there are ways. And finally, the one that 13 people said, because it's part of a YouTube video about this, and I know it. The Knight's chest eye and Rudy's disease giving him some sort of thing in the dark world or being related to the dark world somehow. There's a reason 13 people said this. It is the most interesting idea. The idea that the reason the Knight's all fucked up in the dark world is because Rudy is entering the dark world with this disease in his chest. And it's causing him to morph and and that's why he's not only powerful because he's like got the power of 2 beings or whatever melded into one. But it's also the reason why there's this eye in the Knight's chest that is unexplained at the moment. Funnily enough, and perhaps this sort of exposes a bit that this is a cool idea more than it is a piece of evidence necessarily. People mentioned that using powers in the dark world is what gave Rudy his illness, just as much as they mentioned Rudy's using his illness in the light world to gain powers in the dark world. So, like, the idea is just that the illness is involved. There's not even a consensus on whether or not the illness is from the light world, like it's a naturally occurring illness, and then when you go into the dark world because you have that illness, you've got like superpowers, or if going into the dark world for too long gives you this illness, and maybe the powers are not a part of the illness, but rather he gained the powers and gained the illness at the same time, and now it's made him weaker in the light world. And one of the main points for this, which I do think is interesting, I've said that a lot, but I'm saying it specifically so that people know that I don't dislike this theory necessarily. I just don't think it's true. Okay? The reason people give for this is the dialogue during the night fight, where like Chris seems to like get this like migraine that comes on and they can barely stay focused, and it's almost like the illness is being projected onto you, right? I mean, there is a very good explanation for that. And it's, I think, the thing that you interpreted as the first time, or at least the thing I did interpret it as the first time, which is that either A, the Knight has this overwhelming aura of darkness, and it reminds Chris of their trauma in the bunker, which is causing them to have a fear reaction, or B, seeing the knight, who is Des or whatever, someone who reminds Chris of their dark deeds or their promise they've been unable to keep, is causing Chris to have this physical reaction of like, oh God, it's actually happening, right? Like all this stuff is happening. Like if this is Des, dear Lord, Chris is looking at her skeleton, essentially, like her rotting corpse, or maybe. Like, I think the reaction is fairly understandable, even if it isn't some sort of like illness projection power. Because at the same time, while Chris is feeling all these things, Susie and Rosse seem fine. I mean, Rosse being fine is one thing, because Rosse is a darkener, not a lightener, but Susie should not be fine, right? Susie's peppy, if anything. So I don't know if I totally buy into that, is what I'm saying. And then the other question about this is, if Rudy is the knight because of this conspiracy, or even of his own volition, and the illness is what's giving him the powers to be the knight, was the illness part of the plan? Like, if Rudy didn't happen to contract this illness, would he have been unable to be the knight? That seems wrong. It seems like it should be more thought out than that, right? I don't know. But hey, I can't say it's the worst idea ever. All right? It's cool, for sure. If it were to be true, very cool. There are a couple other things I want to bring up that aren't necessarily counter evidence to people's exact points, but just to the idea of Rudy being the knight in general. And they're things I've brought up in previous videos for the most part. One of those things is that the knight is heavily associated with red. They shoot red energy out when they're roaring and using that final attack in the fight, and they're signified by red, because the rest of them are black and white, so we don't get any colors there. And while Rudy could be associated with red because he is, of course, Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, even though he doesn't even have a red nose. Noel does. Like, you could even take that as obvious evidence that Rudy is not supposed to be, the knight, because he's not specifically related to red. They've even taken his red nose away. Chris and Des are so much more strongly associated with the knight. And, of course, I don't think Chris is the knight, even though I made a video called Chris Knight. I don't legitimately think that Chris is literally the knight. But the knight acts very Chris-like, and so that connection seems much stronger than anything Rudy has as a connection to this red color, right, that the knight projects. Speaking of the parallels between the knight and Chris, we can see them with Des, right? Chris and Des, oh yeah, they're both sort of rebellious teenagers, or at least Des was when she disappeared. They're both sort of the black sheep of their family, as well as sort of the town at large. So there's a reason why they might end up paralleling each other, right? Why would Rudy parallel Chris? That's my question. Why would Rudy act like Chris, or Chris act like Rudy? I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe you guys do in the comments, Rudy Knight believers? I'm sure you'll have them. How would Rudy know about the pretend game? So this one's a little bit obnoxious because it's kind of my own pet theory, but Ram mentions in chapter 3 that the reason why King and Queen and Tenna and Spampton and I guess Jevil and Task Manager know about each other is because Chris and an unnamed girl, probably Des or Noel, I'm leaning towards Des personally, used to play games with these objects in the Dreamer's living room. And while they were playing these games, they would assign these characters, these objects, personalities, and that's carried into the dark world a little bit, clearly, through the way that Queen and King know each other. So the question becomes, how would Rudy know about that? Like, sure, maybe he would have been supervising the kids sometimes, so he'd know some of the details. but not to the extent that Chris or Des would, right? So that does seem to, again, point in the direction away from Rudy, for me personally. 4, okay, if Rudy's illness is caused by Dark World stuff, can't he heal himself? I mean, I know that seems a little obnoxious, but the whole point of Noelle's dialogue in chapter 2 is her saying that, like, a world where anything could be healed with a little spell, right? It's supposed to bring to mind the idea that Noelle would probably want more Dark Worlds because she'd be able to save Rudy with her magic. So if Rudy's been in the Dark Worlds the whole time, why doesn't he do that shit himself? Maybe it's impossible because it's a Dark World-born illness or something. But it would be something the story would have to tackle, so it does add another layer of complexity. And another question is, his line, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, I have to get better for Noelle. Would he really put himself in that much mortal danger to get Des back? Because even if he did, wouldn't Carol kind of ruin their lives? Right? Maybe he just thinks, if I get Des back, Carol will go back to normal. She'll stop being a dictator. But I don't know, man. He seems like he really doesn't want to be sick. So if the Dark Worlds were making him sick, why not just let Carol do it? Or Chris? Or Asgore? He doesn't have to do them all. Maybe he has to fight the heroes, but, like, we didn't even see the Knight in the first 2. So, I don't know. It just seems a little odd to me, the idea that he'd want to get better so bad, and then, like, for Noelle, so he can go and do all these Noelle things, and then his plan is like, yeah, I'm gonna die, but I'll save Des doing it. I don't know. It's kind of in character, because he's obviously pushing himself in order to help Noelle, but it also seems kind of out of character because he's in denial about being sick. He's not conscious that he is actively harming himself. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? This is, again, pretty nitpicky, but how would Rudy have found out about the Dark Worlds? If Des is the Knight, she presumably went into the shelter, and we know the shelter's a Dark World now. That kind of solves itself. Did Rudy go into the shelter to look for her and find out what a Dark World is and decide to become the Knight? Because if so, why doesn't he just go into the shelter to look for Des? You know? That's a question I think a lot of these non-Des Knight theories have to answer, is like, why does making more darkness outside of the shelter help? If they found out about the Dark Worlds from the shelter, why don't they just continue looking in the shelter? Wouldn't she be in there still? I don't know. And finally, and most importantly, in my opinion, the sort of nail in the Rudy Knight coffin for me is the narrative cost. And I've put this as a bullet point in a lot of these Knight analysis videos before. The narrative cost. But I've never actually explained in detail what I mean by that. And I think if I do in this case, you might understand why I can't get on board with this theory. All right? So, to start, we need to know what Deltarune is actually about. What is the theme of Deltarune's story? Well, we've got a lot of sub-themes that are very easy to identify. Growing up, for example, we have a lot of nostalgia about childhood stuff, toys, etc., and the anxieties about, you know, Azrael being in college, people growing apart, that kind of stuff. Dreams. The Dark Worlds are constantly associated with dreaming. It seems to be some sort of projection of a person's mind, so that's definitely there. Fear. Again, as I mentioned before, Chris's power seems to be courage, while the Titans seem to be made of fear. And as the Titans are antagonists, you would think they would relate to the theme somehow. And fate, with the prophecy and being locked into a specific path in life, right? So, some examples of these themes in action. The Holiday and Dreamer families want to get Des back, but they have no way to do so, or at least they haven't been able to do so far. The past is something outside of their control. Both fear and dreams are mechanisms for which control can be taken away from you. Fear takes control of your body, makes you do things that you wouldn't normally do out of instinct, and dreams take control away from your mind. You're unable to actually, at least unless you're lucid dreaming, I guess, think properly. You're kind of just going with emotions in your dreams, right? And both of these are ways of taking control away from your present. And finally, the prophecy takes control away from the future because it can't be changed and it's already written. In simple terms, the theme of Deltarune is your choices don't matter, or at least that's the idea that we are going to challenge throughout Deltarune. And I think we all kind of, we're all nodding our heads, right? That makes sense. So the question becomes, how does Rudy fit into this theme as an antagonist? Because the antagonist of Deltarune's story should be somebody who wields control over our heroes then, or has had control wielded over them and now they are trying to take that back through terrible means, right? They should be someone who relates to this theme of control in a way that is antagonistic to our heroes. In other words, they should be the person who is depriving our heroes of control over their lives. That way, when we defeat this antagonist, the knight, we learn the lesson of the story. Like, okay, the way they were trying to take back control or the way they were being overly controlling is wrong. And for Carol, this obviously makes sense. Almost too obviously, right? Her literal main action in the story is taking control away from Noelle because she's a control freak. She not only micromanages Noelle, but also the town at large, and she's probably doing it in an effort to prevent more bad things from happening after Des disappeared, right? So if she was the antagonist, then obviously we've got a moral of the story there, right? When we defeat her, we learn, like, okay, you can take precautions and do everything you can, but you can't suffocate the people you care about. You can't literally freeze them in place or whatever the line is in Deltarune. The holidays were frozen in time in order to try to protect them, right? That's very clean. Almost too clean, right? Like, that's like a Hallmark movie moral, which is why I think it'll be more complicated. And for Des, it can be making sense. It will just be more complicated. Des was seemingly a rebel who felt like she'd lost control over her life due to her overbearing family. So it's possible her disappearance could be related to trying to take that control back in a manner that became self-destructive. Like, maybe she fulfilled that fantasy that is put forward in Chapter 2 of escaping into the Dark Worlds and abandoning reality completely. And that is what turned her into the Knight or whatever, corrupted her, made her become lost, etc., etc., etc. And then we have the moral of the story being essentially, you can't just retreat from reality in order to try to take back control, right? The idea of that, like, sometimes you have to let go of control in order to live a satisfying life, right? You can't always be in control. Obviously, you should have control over your life, the little things you do, and the ways you can regain that control are through, your relationships with other people. You control yourself, right? And that feels like a much more Toby Fox kind of moral. And obviously, I'm not a huge Rudy Knight believer, so maybe Rudy does relate to these themes of control super strongly. But I just don't really get that feeling. We mentioned earlier, Rudy, if anything, is a person who seems to cede control to other people all the time. Instead of trying to, take a stand and reunite the families by helping Asgore or, telling Asgore, you have to move on in order to help Toriel. He doesn't do anything. He just lets them worry about their own stuff. He's purposefully ceding his control. He wants Noelle to be happy, but he won't change anything about her life to achieve that. And he's in denial about his health instead of trying to actively fight it. He's leaving his health up to fate. He's leaving Noelle's happiness up to the Carol's whims because he doesn't want to try to impose any control over that situation. And that could be a villainous outlook, right? This idea that you should just put everything up to fate, man, and who cares what happens as long as it's not your fault. The problem is that's not a very active perspective, right? It's not kind of antagonist material, if you know what I mean. Like, if that was Rudy's idea, why would he be the knight? He should just leave it up to fate and go, okay, I'm throwing up my hands. Whatever happens will happen. If Des comes back, she'll come back. It will be meant to be. If she doesn't, we'll have to go on without her. It's what was meant to be, you know? And that kind of leads me to my final thought about this, which is that that's Rudy's role in the story. It's to say, yes, you do have to fight to gain control over your life, but the fight is worth it, right? Rudy could live his whole life and then die without ever helping the people that he cares about because he's too afraid to take a stand. He's too afraid to assert himself and take control over his life. But that's just not a perspective that the knight could have, because the knight is so active. You know, like, that is not a perspective for Rudy to have that would lead to him creating dark fountains. He would let Carol do that, or he'd let Chris do that, or he'd let Des do it. And that's my thesis, essentially, of this theory, is that Rudy purposefully is ceding control in his life in every aspect. And so while his importance to the story is probably going to be a lesson about how that is bad, you shouldn't do it, even though things might look terrible or set in stone through the prophecy, I don't think he can be the knight. I don't think he can be the main antagonist. The end. Wow, this one was long, I think. Let's see, how long was that? I was talking for a while. Yeah, almost an hour and a half. Jesus. I guess that's kind of because this was two theories smashed into one. It was a Rudy Knight and a Rudy analysis. I hope you enjoyed. I did. And even though I spent a month on this, it was fun. So I'm sure you'll have plenty of comments to leave me below because it's been a month. So that's fine. I will read as many as I can, as usual. And yeah, I will maybe do another community post talking about the next theory on Monday, once I decide which one I want to do next. And I can get your feedback once again. That seems like a fun thing to do. It might not be as huge of a section of the video as it was in this one, but you know, we'll see. And like and subscribe, you know, all that fun stuff. And I'll see you then. Bye.